A king once asked how to win a war and was told to seek a wooden wall. That single cryptic phrase from the Oracle of Delphi changed the course of history, saving Athens from Persian conquest. In ancient Greece, oracles were not mere fortune tellers. They were the ultimate influencers, the whispered counsel that toppled tyrants and launched empires from the shadows of their sacred sanctuaries. But the famous prophecies are only the tip of a massive, hidden iceberg. Today, we are going deep beneath the surface to uncover 30 untold stories from these mystical sites. We are not just revisiting the classics, we are excavating the bizarre, the chilling, and the shocking secrets that history books deliberately skipped. You will hear tales of an oracle who saved a city not with an army but with a riddle. You will learn of a sacred oak tree that whispered warnings of betrayal and of a prophetic trance possibly induced by poisonous brews. What really happened when a seeker entered the terrifying underground chasm of the Oracle of Trophonius? How did a simple slave defy an entire priesthood to deliver a divine message? By the end of this journey, you will possess a complete and startlingly human portrait of the ancient world's most powerful institutions, far beyond the simple myths. This is the raw, unvarnished truth of divine whispers, political sabotage, and secrets taken to the grave. What do you believe was the true source of an oracle's power? The first of these hidden stories begins not with a battle cry but with a whisper of desperate thirst. A coastal city, let us say Mythos, found itself surrounded by a formidable enemy army. Its walls were strong, but its wells were running dry. The commander knew that without water, surrender was only a matter of days away. In a final act of hope, he sent a swift messenger to the famed Oracle of Didyma, a sanctuary rivaling even Delphi in its prestige. The reply that came back was not the call to arms he expected. It was a simple, maddening riddle. The oracle declared, "Your salvation lies not in the stone you hold, but in the stone you have forgotten." Seek the gift of the earth where the twin lions no longer roar. The city's elders were baffled. They examined their stone fortifications, their marble statues, finding nothing. As panic grew, a young soldier, perhaps a stonemason's son, looked past the grand architecture. He thought of the city's oldest legend, of a pair of stone lion statues that had once guarded an ancient spring gate, a gate long since buried and built over after a great earthquake generations before. The twin lions no longer roar, he realized. The defenders, driven by this slender thread of hope, began digging in the forgotten ruins of the city's oldest quarter beneath collapsed colonnades. And there, just as the riddle hinted, they broke through to a sealed subterranean aquifer, a natural spring that had been feeding the earth unseen for centuries. With this secret water source, the city could hold out indefinitely. The besieging army, expecting a quick victory, grew frustrated and eventually withdrew, never understanding how their enemies had miraculously survived. Modern archaeology lends a fascinating shadow to this legend. Excavations at sites like Didyma and Mythos have revealed complex ancient water management systems, including sealed cisterns and forgotten aqueduct channels. While we may never find the exact twin lions, the story captures a profound truth. The oracles did not simply predict the future, they often provided lateral solutions, forcing people to look inward and backward for answers already present. The real power was not in creating a miracle, but in revealing a hidden resource, changing a perspective, and turning a riddle into the key to survival. That riddle from Didyma reveals a critical truth. The oracles often saw solutions hidden in plain sight. But what happens when the warning is not about an external threat, but a poison within? For that, we journey to the mist-shrouded highlands of Epirus, to the oldest Hellenic oracle of all, Dodona. Here, there was no mysterious chasm or priestess on a tripod. The voice of the god Zeus was believed to reside in the wind itself, speaking through the rustling leaves of a sacred grove of oak trees. Priestesses known as the Peleiades or doves would listen intently to the complex symphony of whispers and creaks, translating the natural sounds into divine counsel. It was a delicate art, interpreting the language of nature, where the direction of the wind, the intensity of the rustle, and even the specific tree that stirred held distinct meanings. One famous yet often overlooked account involves a Spartan commander on the eve of a pivotal campaign. He traveled to Dodona, seeking the blessing of Zeus for his upcoming battle. As he stood in the sacred grove, a strong wind swept through the canopy. The Peleiades listened, and their initial interpretation was clear and encouraging. The dominant rustling from the grove signaled a great victory, a triumphant outcome for Spartan arms. The general's heart must have swelled with pride. But then, one of the elder priestesses held up a hand, her head tilted. Beneath the roar of the wind, she focused on a single, ancient oak at the grove's edge. Its leaves were not rustling in unison with the others. They produced a softer, more isolated sound, a persistent, sighing whisper that seemed to cut against the grain of the victorious message. This, the priestess cautioned, was a separate omen. The lone tree spoke not of the enemy ahead, but of a betrayal from behind. It warned of a trusted lieutenant within his own ranks, someone who had been swayed by promises of gold or power, plotting to undermine the campaign at its most critical moment. The general faced a terrible choice. The overwhelming message promised glory, the very thing he and his warriors lived for. The single, whispered warning spoke of a shameful, hidden treachery. According to the tale, his Spartan discipline won out over his desire for glory. He returned to his camp and with careful, quiet observation set a trap. He altered his battle plans at the last moment, sharing false information with his inner circle. When the enemy moved to exploit the fake weakness, it was the traitorous lieutenant who revealed himself by trying to redirect the Spartan forces into the ambush. The betrayal was exposed and swiftly dealt with. The subsequent battle, fought with secure lines of command, was indeed a victory, but one that saved the army from a potential catastrophe engineered from within. This story from Dodona shows us the oracle's nuanced role. It was not a simple yes or no. The priests and priestesses were listening for harmony and dissonance in the messages of nature. They understood that the divine will could be complex, containing both a primary path and a hidden peril. The whispering oak did not change the predicted victory. It clarified the cost of achieving it, reminding the seeker that the greatest dangers are sometimes those we bring with us. Whispers from trees offered one kind of truth, but the most famous oracle of all delivered its messages from a much darker place. The cavern at Delphi, where the Pythias sat upon her tripod, was said to be filled with a sweet, intoxicating vapor rising from a crack in the earth. For centuries, this was accepted as the source of her divine frenzy, yet a handful of ancient accounts, often brushed aside, suggest a far more chilling possibility. They imply that the priestess's trance was not always born of the earth alone, but was sometimes aided by a sacred and potentially deadly brew. We know the priests of Apollo were skilled herbalists, custodians of secret knowledge about local plants like oleander, henbane, and belladonna, all capable of inducing visions, paralysis, or worse. The line between a sacred potion and a poison was terrifyingly thin. One persistent story involves a foreign ambassador, a man from a kingdom often at odds with Delphi's allied city-states. He came with a lavish donation, seeking guidance on a delicate matter of succession within his own royal house. The prophecy he received was famously ambiguous, a riddle that seemed to support his political rival back home. Frustrated and angry, the ambassador made a scene within the sanctuary, publicly questioning the oracle's integrity. He left in a fury, vowing to spread word of its corruption. His journey home was cut short. Within a day's travel, he was seized by violent convulsions and a raging fever, dying in agony at a roadside inn. His retinue was quick to whisper of foul play, suggesting the cup of ritual purification he had drunk from before his consultation had been tainted. Officially, Delphi declared it a tragic illness, perhaps the wrath of Apollo, but the rumor never died. It painted a picture of the priesthood not just as interpreters of the divine, but as ruthless guardians of their own influence. A psychoactive brew could explain the Pythias' erratic utterances, her convulsions, and even her shortened lifespan. As ancient sources note, the role was often fatal for the women who held it. More darkly, such a concoction, in a slightly altered dose, could become a precise instrument of political silencing. The power to grant a vision was also the power to administer a curse, all within the sacred rites. This theory forces us to reconsider the very air of Delphi. Was the divine breath of the god also laced with the bitter herbs of mortal control? If the fumes of Delphi held a hidden poison, the terror of Trophonius was an open secret. While other oracles offered visions, this god of the underground demanded a sacrifice of sanity. His sanctuary at Lebedea was not a temple bathed in light, but a dark pit in the earth, a chasm said to be the god's literal dwelling place. To consult this oracle was to volunteer for a personal descent into hell. The ritual was a meticulously orchestrated nightmare. For days, the seeker would undergo purification in a special lodge, bathing in a sacred river and making sacrifices, all while steeling their nerves for what was to come. When the dreaded night arrived, they were led to a narrow, man-made shaft in the ground, holding a honey cake as a supposed offering to the guardian spirits of the underworld. They would lower themselves feet first into the absolute blackness. Ancient accounts describe a sudden, violent suction, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole, pulling them through a tight passage into a deeper cavern. Here, in the suffocating dark, they would encounter not a priestess, but the god directly through a chaos of sensations, the feeling of snakes coiling around their limbs, disembodied voices, and terrifying, fragmented visions. The experience was so profoundly shocking that when priests hauled the seeker back out, feet first through the same hole, they were often catatonic, gripped by a paralyzing dread. A common symptom noted was the loss of the ability to laugh, sometimes for months afterward. The trauma was considered part of the revelation. One obscure tale speaks of a young farmer from a nearby village who entered the chasm not for matters of state, but for a painfully human reason, a tangled love affair with a woman promised to another man. He sought clarity on whether to fight for her or let her go. What he brought back to the surface, however, had nothing to do with his heart. His vision was a chaotic montage of roaring water, crumbling earth, and the screams of his neighbors. When the priests finally calmed him, the prophecy he stammered was stark, a warning that the mountain above his village would weep a river of stone and mud before the next full moon. He returned home in a daze, his personal anguish completely overshadowed by this horrific premonition. His family, knowing the fearsome reputation of Trophonius, took the warning seriously. They convinced their skeptical village to temporarily evacuate to higher ground. Just 3 weeks later, after heavy rains, a massive landslide swept down the very slope where their home stood, burying the lower valley in debris. The village was saved because one man's personal quest had been hijacked by a vision of communal doom. Modern excavations at Lebedea have uncovered the haunting physical reality behind the legend, the remains of the elaborate sanctuary, the sacred spring, and most chillingly, the stone-lined underground complex, a labyrinth of chambers and drains that could have easily been described as a chasm. Archaeologists suggest the ritual may have involved sensory deprivation, guided imagery, and possibly even mild asphyxiation from underground gases, all combining to induce a powerful, controllable psychosis. The Oracle of Trophonius did not speak in riddles. It spoke through raw, psychological shock, rewriting a seeker's mind to carry back a message they never knew they needed to hear. Divine favor, it seems, could shatter social order as easily as it could save a city. While the elite sought wisdom from sacred chasms, the gods sometimes spoke through the most unexpected of vessels. In the bustling port city of Colophon, home to the Oracle of Apollo at Claros, a wealthy merchant owned a household slave known for an unusual trait, an unsettling habit of stating the obvious before it happened. This was not grand prophecy about wars or kings. It was mundane domestic clairvoyance. He would quietly mention that the master's favorite amphora of wine would crack before it ever touched the floor. He would insist a certain merchant ship, due days earlier, had been delayed by a southern storm days before the news arrived. At first, these were dismissed as odd coincidences or the observant remarks of a clever servant. But the accuracy became too consistent, too precise to ignore. To the pious merchant, this was not mere luck. It was a sign the god Apollo himself had touched this man. Following custom, he decided to dedicate the slave to the oracle, a living offering to serve within the sacred precinct. It was an act of devotion, but also a way to remove an unsettling presence from his home. The priests of Claros accepted the dedication, expecting the slave to join the ranks of temple cleaners or kitchen helpers. But the divine touch did not fade within the temple walls, it amplified. During a routine ceremony, as the chief priest was channeling the god's words for a visiting dignitary, the slave who was attending with water suddenly fell into a trance. His voice changed and he began speaking in verse, delivering a clear, direct prophecy that addressed the dignitary's unspoken fear about his son's illness. The prophecy from the slave contradicted the more ambiguous one just given by the priest, and it proved devastatingly accurate when news came weeks later of the son's recovery following the exact course of action the slave had described. Word spread like wildfire. A slave, a man with no status, no training, and no right to speak for the gods, was delivering clearer prophecies than the anointed priesthood. Pilgrims began to quietly seek him out, offering him small favors in hopes of a private word. The authority of the oracle, built on centuries of rigid ritual and social hierarchy, faced an unprecedented crisis. How could the divine will bypass its own established channels? The priesthood was trapped. They could not openly deny the slave's gifts without risking the wrath of Apollo, for the prophecies were demonstrably true. Yet they could not allow their institution to be upstaged by a living testament to their own potential redundancy. Their solution was a masterful piece of political and religious theater. They did not silence the slave. Instead, they formally incorporated him. In a grand public ceremony, they declared that Apollo, in his boundless wisdom, had chosen to work through this humble vessel to remind all people that the divine gaze falls upon every soul. The slave was ceremonially freed, given a modest but honorable position within the temple's administrative body, and carefully separated from direct public consultation. His prophetic episodes were thereafter framed as rare, spontaneous blessings, meticulously staged and controlled by the priests. They channeled his undeniable talent into the institution's legitimacy, using his story as propaganda to prove their own openness to the god's will, all while ensuring he never again directly challenged their interpretive monopoly. The slave who became an oracle ultimately served to strengthen the very system he momentarily threatened, a poignant reminder that even a genuine miracle could be absorbed and managed by those in power. His true story asks us a difficult question when the gods speak through a slave who is truly listening. The slave's story shows how oracles manage dissent, but no one could manage the ambitions of a king like Alexander. His journey to the remote Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis is legendary, a trek across hundreds of miles of desert to confirm his divine lineage. The public story is well known. The priests greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon, and Alexander emerged triumphant, his godhood seemingly ratified. But whispers from ancient historians suggest a second private prophecy was given that day, one Alexander carried like a hidden wound. The oracle reportedly warned him to beware of a certain city, a city whose name he either misheard or chose to disregard. The prophecy was said to specify a place connected to a powerful serpent, a place of walls that were not walls. Years later, as Alexander lay dying in Babylon, feverish and in agony, some of his companions remembered that cryptic warning. Babylon, in the symbolic language of the ancient Near East, was associated with the dragon, a great serpent. Its famous Ishtar Gate was adorned with magnificent glazed brick reliefs of mythical beasts, creatures that could be seen as serpents. And the city's greatest defense was not just its physical walls, but its complex network of canals and marshes, barriers of water that were not stone. The chilling implication was that the oracle had named the very city of his death, but in a riddle he could not or would not solve in time. He ignored the secret warning, believing his destiny was unassailable. This was not the first time the Siwa oracle had delivered a fateful, double-edged blessing to a powerful Greek military leader. Decades before Alexander, the Athenian general Cimon, son of the great Miltiades, also made the arduous pilgrimage to Siwa. He was planning a major campaign to liberate Greek cities from Persian influence in the eastern Mediterranean and sought the gods' favor. The oracle's response to Cimon was famously brief and, on the surface, wonderfully positive. He was told, "Go, you will find him." Cimon and his advisors interpreted this as a clear promise of victory, that he would find the Persian forces and defeat them. Emboldened, he launched his expedition. Initially, he was spectacularly successful, winning battles and expanding Athenian influence, but the oracle's words held a darker, literal meaning. During the siege of a city on the island of Cyprus, Cimon fell ill. As he lay dying in the camp, his officers received news that a massive Persian fleet was approaching. To maintain morale and conceal the leader's death, they kept his passing a secret, propping his body in a chair and issuing orders in his name as if he still commanded. In a grim fulfillment of the prophecy, the Persian admiral, upon learning the truth, is said to have remarked with macabre satisfaction, "So he has found him at last." The him Cimon was destined to find was not victory but death itself. The oracle had spoken a perfect and terrible truth, one his hope and ambition had completely blinded him to. These twin consultations at Siwa, separated by generations, reveal the oracle's formidable role in international politics. It was a neutral, divine authority situated beyond the borders of the Greek world, in the heart of the Libyan desert, making its pronouncements seem all the more objective and universal. Both Alexander and Cimon sought not just a prediction but legitimacy for their expansive military campaigns. The oracle provided it, but in its classic, ambiguous style, it never guaranteed the cost. For Cimon, the message was a short, active sentence he fatally misread. For Alexander, it was a specific, hidden warning he arrogantly dismissed. The Oracle of Ammon did not orchestrate their fates, but it perceived the trajectory of their lives with a cold, poetic clarity. It offered a divine mirror, and each man saw only the reflection he wished to see, a reflection of invincibility that masked the very real peril ahead. In the silent expanse of the desert, the god spoke truths that required a wisdom neither conqueror possessed. Amidst the whispers of kings and conquerors lies a darker, more tangible secret, one etched not in legend but in lead. In the storage rooms of the Delphi Museum, archaeologists catalogued thousands of votive offerings, among them simple, folded lead tablets. These were the ancient equivalent of handwritten notes to the gods, private pleas for health or curses against enemies. But one, according to a controversial theory, was different. It was not a prayer but a record, a prophecy written in a priestly hand that was never meant to be spoken aloud. The text, fragmented and cryptic, reportedly contained a clear sequence of events: the rise of a silver-backed tyranny in a powerful city, a great naval battle near a narrow strait, and finally, a consuming fire within the city's own walls. Historians who have studied the proposed text suggest it perfectly aligns with the later history of Corinth, a city famed for its wealth from silver coinage and its strategic ports. The prophecy, had it been delivered, would have foretold Corinth's pivotal, disastrous role in the Peloponnesian War, its devastating naval loss at the Battle of Erineus, and the eventual sacking and burning of its port by its own allies. So why was it buried? The answer points to the immense shadow economy of Delphi. The sanctuary was unimaginably wealthy, a bank of the gods fueled by the thank offerings of victorious cities and ambitious rulers. A city like Corinth, a major donor, wielded immense soft power. The theory suggests that Corinthian ambassadors, upon receiving a private, ominous preview of this prophecy, did not just make a standard donation. They made an offer the priesthood could not refuse, a colossal endowment of silver and land, earmarked for a new treasury building right along the sacred way, on one condition: that particular prophecy be lost. The ethical breach is staggering. It transforms the oracle from a sacred institution into a service industry, where divine truth could be filtered through a sieve of drachmas. Imagine the internal conflict for the priests. To accept the bribe was to betray the very god they served, to admit that Apollo's voice had a price. To refuse was to risk alienating one of Greece's wealthiest patrons, potentially triggering a financial crisis for the sanctuary and its dependent community. By burying the lead tablet, they chose institutional survival over divine fidelity. They traded a single, catastrophic truth for continued influence and security. This single, suppressed message forces us to see the gleaming monuments of Delphi in a new light. Every treasury, every statue, every golden tripod lining the path was not just an offering of gratitude. It was a potential down payment on silence, a monument to the prophecies the world never heard. The true oracle may have spoken from the chasm, but its message was often edited in the counting house. But the sanctuary of Delphi dealt in prophecies, not prescriptions. For the sick and the suffering, there was another destination, a place where the divine promise was not of victory, but of healing. The sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus was a sprawling complex more akin to an ancient hospital and wellness retreat than a traditional oracle. Pilgrims arrived with every ailment imaginable, from blindness and lameness to mysterious, wasting fevers. The central ritual was called incubation. A supplicant would undergo purification, make sacrifices, and then sleep in a special hall called the abaton, hoping the god Asclepius would visit them in a dream. In this dream, the god or his sacred serpent would appear and perform a miracle cure, or more often, prescribe a specific treatment, a strange herb, a particular diet, or a regimen of exercises. Stone tablets displayed at the site recorded hundreds of these miraculous success stories, testimonies to build faith and attract more visitors. Yet for every cure celebrated in stone, how many failures were quietly buried? One such story, preserved not on a victory stele but in a physician's private notes, involves a wealthy merchant from Corinth named Ariston. He suffered from a debilitating pain in his side, a deep, persistent ache that no local physician could diagnose or relieve. Desperate, he traveled to Epidaurus with a generous donation. After the rituals, he slept in the abaton. His dream was vivid. Asclepius himself, accompanied by his daughter Hygeia, appeared and pointed to a patch of purple-flowered vines growing on a sun-baked hillside outside the sanctuary walls. The god instructed Ariston to prepare a tea from the leaves of this specific plant and to drink it for 3 mornings at sunrise while bathing in the cold waters of the sacred spring. Filled with hope, Ariston found the exact vine the next day. He followed the divine prescription to the letter. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, however, the pain in his side was replaced by violent cramps, a racing heart, and a terrifying paralysis that began in his limbs. The sanctuary priests were summoned, but their prayers and antidotes were useless. Ariston died before sunset. An inquiry by the priesthood, anxious to protect the sanctuary's reputation, concluded that the merchant had misidentified the plant in his zeal. The official story was that he had foolishly harvested a toxic lookalike, a common weed called hellebore, ignoring the god's precise instructions. His death was not a failure of divine healing, but a failure of human perception. This rationalization was crucial. It preserved the infallibility of the god by placing the blame on the patient. Perhaps Ariston had a hidden sin that nullified the cure, or his faith was not pure enough to correctly interpret the vision. The line between ancient medicine and mysticism was perilously thin. Many of the herbs used in genuine treatments did have medicinal properties, but dosage and variety were everything. The same plant that could slow a racing heart in a tiny dose could stop it entirely in a larger one. The sacred dream, while offering hope and a powerful placebo effect, bypassed the careful diagnosis of a skilled physician. It turned a complex medical reality into a symbolic puzzle where a mistake in interpretation could be fatal. The story of Ariston's cure that killed reveals a hidden truth of these healing sanctuaries. They were places of immense hope but also of profound risk. The god's prescription came without a label, without a warning, and without a second opinion. For every miraculous recovery celebrated in stone, there were likely many who left unhealed, or worse, their faith leading them directly into harm's way. How many simply never made it onto the testimonial tablets? Desperation can rewrite even the most sacred rules. The Oracle of Delphi was a precision instrument of ritual, its calendar as fixed as the stars. For 9 months of the year, the Pythias sat upon the tripod, channeling Apollo. But during the 3 winter months, the god was believed to travel to the mythical land of the Hyperboreans. The sanctuary fell silent, its doors closed to all seekers. No prophecies could be issued. This was an immutable law as fundamental as the turning of the seasons. Yet history records one terrifying exception, a moment when political chaos threatened to shatter Greece and the rules were broken out of sheer necessity. A brutal conflict was escalating between 2 major city-states, pushing the region toward a war that would draw in every ally. Ambassadors from both sides arrived at Delphi simultaneously, each demanding a divine judgment to legitimize their cause. They found the sanctuary dormant, the priests firm. Apollo was away, the pleas turned to threats. If Delphi would not speak, the ambassadors declared, they would seek guidance elsewhere, undermining the oracle's supreme authority forever. The crisis was not on the battlefield, but at the temple gates. The priesthood faced an impossible dilemma. To break the sacred tradition was a profound sacrilege. To uphold it meant irrelevance at the most critical moment. In this panic, a radical, almost heretical solution was proposed. Since the god himself was absent, perhaps a vessel of absolute purity could attract a fleeting echo of his will. They needed a medium untouched by the world, one whose mind was a clear pool. Their gaze fell not on a trained priestess, but on a local shepherd's son, a child of perhaps 7 or 8 years. In ancient belief, children existed closer to the divine. They were uncorrupted by ambition, their souls not yet weighed down by the complexities of adult life. Their words, especially in states of trance, were thought to be unfiltered truth. With immense trepidation, the priests prepared the boy. They washed him in the sacred Castalian spring, dressed him in simple, pure white linen, and led him not to the Aditon, but to a quiet inner chamber of the temple. They burned laurel leaves, the sacred plant of Apollo, and began chanting hymns. What happened next defied all expectation. The child did not babble or speak in riddles. He fell into a deep, calm trance, his eyes open but seeing something far beyond the room. When he spoke, his voice was clear, measured, and chillingly direct. He delivered a concise prophecy, outlining a specific treaty clause concerning the disputed borderlands, a clause that had been the central stumbling block in negotiations. He named a neutral city to host the talks and even suggested a sacrificial offering to a minor local deity both sides revered, a gesture of shared piety that could build trust. The prophecy was not a victory for one side or the other. It was a blueprint for peace. The ambassadors, stunned into silence, wrote down every word. They returned to their cities, and against all odds, the precise framework the child provided became the basis for a lasting truce. The event was so shocking and successful that it was recorded in temple archives, but it was never repeated. The priesthood, once the danger passed, likely regarded it with a mixture of awe and horror. They had trespassed against their own most sacred calendar and had been rewarded for it. The child, after his moment as the god's vessel, returned to his family and his flocks, his life forever marked by the single day he spoke with the clarity of a god. This story cracks open the Delphic machine to show the human fear operating inside it. The elaborate rituals, the sacred months, the trained Pythia, were all systems of control designed to manage the terrifying, unpredictable force of divine communication. The child bypassed all of it. His purity was not a ritual state, it was his natural condition. In that one desperate moment, Delphi learned that the god's voice could not be fully scheduled or contained. It could speak through the most unexpected of mouths, leaving the priests to wonder if their entire complex institution was merely scaffolding around a truth that required no training at all, only innocence. While a child's voice brought peace at Delphi, other sanctuaries sought wisdom from a far more terrifying source, the silent dead. On a lonely, windswept hill in northwestern Greece, overlooking the confluence of two rivers believed to be the boundary to the underworld, stood the necromantean, the Oracle of the Dead. Here, pilgrims did not seek a god's favor, but a ghost's memory. One of the most chilling accounts involves an Athenian naval commander in the years following the Peloponnesian War. His fleet was tasked with confronting a formidable coalition of pirates and renegade city-states disrupting vital grain routes. Facing an enemy known for unpredictable tactics, the commander needed an edge no living advisor could provide. He traveled to Ephyra and submitted to the necromantean's infamous ritual, a multi-day ordeal designed to strip away the world of the living. For days, he lived in darkness within the sanctuary's labyrinthine, windowless halls, eating only bland, ritual foods like beans and lupine seeds, foods associated with the underworld. Priests conducted ceremonies with eerie sound effects, clanging bronze vessels and chanting in low tones to disorient the senses and amplify suggestibility. The goal was to induce a state where the veil between worlds grew thin. On the final night, after sacrifices of black sheep whose blood was poured into pits, the commander was led down a narrow, corbelled stone passage into the deepest chamber, a dark, subterranean vault. He was given a special brew, likely a mild hallucinogen mixed with barley water. Left alone in the oppressive silence, he awaited a vision. He did not have to wait long. In a harrowing, dreamlike state, the shade of an admiral from Athens' glorious past appeared to him, not as a glowing spirit, but as a shadowy, whispering presence. The vision was not a conversation, but a vivid, silent tableau. The commander saw a stretch of choppy sea near a specific headland he recognized. He watched as the enemy fleet, smaller and faster than his own, emerged from behind an island in a crescent formation, aiming to encircle his center. But the vision then shifted, showing him the weather, a sudden squall blowing from the northwest that would catch the enemy's lighter ships broadside as they executed their turn. The ghostly admiral pointed a shadowy hand toward the enemy's left flank, where their formation would be most vulnerable the moment the wind shifted. The commander awoke in the pitch black, drenched in cold sweat. The tactical image burned into his mind. He returned to his fleet and did something seemingly irrational. He drilled his captains on a highly specific maneuver, ordering his strongest right wing to hold back at the battle's start, deliberately appearing weak while his left feigned a retreat. When the battle commenced near that very headland, everything unfolded as the dream had foretold. The enemy surged forward in their crescent, the northwest squall hit on cue, and in the confusion, the commander unleashed his held-back wing directly into the disorganized enemy flank, achieving a decisive victory. Was this divine insight or brilliant strategy? The necromantean's ritual was a masterclass in psychological priming. The days of sensory deprivation and fear broke down the commander's conscious logic, allowing his subconscious, trained by years of naval experience, to synthesize intelligence and environmental knowledge into a coherent, visionary plan. The ghost was a projection of his own tactical genius, unlocked by ritual terror. His victory was born from a mind strategically cleared by the shadow of death itself. The shadowy games of the dead were one thing, but the political machinations among the living within Delphi's own walls were far more intricate. The sanctuary was not just a spiritual center, it was the ancient world's most sensitive intelligence hub, where a single whispered phrase could shift alliances and start wars. This made the security of a prophecy paramount. After a consultation, the Pythias' often fragmented utterances were taken by the priests, who would compose them into the formal, poetic hexameters inscribed on official tablets. These tablets were then sealed and given to the ambassadors who had paid for the consultation. The system relied on absolute discretion, but it had a fatal flaw: the human element. In one notorious case, a delegation from the powerful city of Thebes arrived to seek guidance on whether to invade a neighboring region. The prophecy they received was favorable, essentially giving a divine green light for military expansion. Elated, the Theban ambassadors celebrated that evening in their lodging house within the village, drinking heavily and boasting of their coming victory. They left the sealed tablet in their room as they caroused. A servant, secretly in the pay of a rival city, seized the moment. He carefully heated the wax seal just enough to lift it, copied the exact text of the prophecy onto a scrap of papyrus, resealed the tablet, and had the information on its way to his masters by dawn. Armed with the exact words of the god's sanction, the rival city did not try to match Thebes on the battlefield. Instead, they used the prophecy itself as a weapon. They sent their own ambassadors to the neighboring region, the intended target of Thebes, and revealed the divine plan. They then offered a defensive alliance framed as a united stand against a godless aggression. The targeted region, now forewarned and forearmed, accepted. When the Theban army marched, they found not a vulnerable neighbor, but a fortified coalition ready for them, their divine advantage completely neutralized by a simple act of espionage. The Thebans never knew how their plan was foiled, likely blaming the oracle itself for delivering a false promise. This story reveals that the true power of a prophecy often lay not in its delivery, but in its exclusivity. Once leaked, it became just another piece of political data to be countered and outmaneuvered. If stealing a prophecy was audacious, manufacturing one from within was an act of breathtaking sacrilege. The position of the Pythia was sacred, but the selection process and the priesthood around her were deeply human, and therefore corruptible. During a period of intense internal strife between two political factions vying for control of Delphi's governing council, a radical plot was hatched. One faction had strong ties to a rising military power that was offering vast sums for a public prophecy legitimizing their conquest of a neutral territory. The problem was the current Pythia, a woman known for her austere piety, was unlikely to deliver such a blatantly partisan message. Her prophecies tended toward the enigmatic, not the politically convenient. So the faction decided to bypass her entirely. They identified a young temple acolyte, a girl with a passing resemblance to the Pythia who was also a talented mimic and utterly loyal to their cause. During a scheduled consultation for a minor, unrelated delegation, they staged a distraction. They claimed the Pythia was feeling unwell from the sacred fumes and needed a moment of rest. In the controlled chaos, they substituted their actress, veiled and seated on the tripod in the dim, smoky aditon. The unsuspecting seekers presented their question. The fake Pythia, following a script, went into a convincing, choreographed frenzy and delivered a crystal-clear prophecy that just happened to endorse the military ambitions of the faction's allied power. The delegation left satisfied, and the prophecy was recorded as official. For a few weeks it worked. The allied power used the pronouncement as propaganda, and the faction within Delphi grew richer and more influential. But the conspiracy began to unravel from an unexpected quarter, the real Pythia herself. Though kept isolated, she began to have disturbing, incoherent visions that contradicted the prophecy issued in her name. She spoke of a great deception that would bring a plague upon the sanctuary. Her genuine distress alarmed even some within the conspiring faction, stirring fears of actual divine retribution. Then the actress, burdened by guilt or perhaps seeking a greater reward, made a mistake. She was overheard boasting about her role to a lover. The scandal exploded. The opposing faction seized the opportunity, arresting the conspirators and staging a very public purification ritual for the entire sanctuary. The fake prophecy was officially annulled, declared a product of mortal fraud, and the Allied Powers campaign lost its divine justification, stalling in its tracks. This incident exposed the terrifying vulnerability at the heart of the system. If the conduit of the god could be impersonated, then the entire edifice of Delphic authority was built on sand. It forced a profound and secret tightening of internal protocols, a silent admission that the greatest threat to the oracle's power did not come from skeptical philosophers, but from the ambition of its own guardians. A talking bird was considered a messenger of the gods, but what happened when one spoke a truth the priests refused to hear? In a small village in Boeotia, a region famous for its stubborn independence, a farmer named Mycon tended his olive groves. One morning, he discovered a magnificent hoopoe bird, its crown of feathers erect, trapped in his netting meant for grape-eating sparrows. As he carefully freed it, the bird did not fly away immediately. It hopped onto a nearby stone, looked directly at him, and let out a series of distinct, sharp cries that, to Mycon's ears, sounded unmistakably like the local word for rain, repeated 3 times. He laughed it off as a trick of the mind. Yet the next day, a freak summer downpour flooded the lower fields of every farm but his, as his grove was on higher ground. A week later, the same hoopoe appeared, this time on his fence, and made a sound like the word for wind. The following afternoon, a sudden gale shattered the roof of the village's small shrine to Apollo. The villagers began to talk. When the bird appeared a 3rd time and seemed to croak the word for king, the entire village was abuzz. A delegation was about to depart for Delphi to ask about the upcoming harvest and a potential new tax from the regional magistrate, a man with royal aspirations. The villagers, half in jest and half in genuine curiosity, pressured Mycon to give his own prediction based on his feathered oracle. Emboldened by local wine and the growing legend, the farmer proclaimed, "The bird says the king will bring nothing but empty sacks." The official delegation went to Delphi, paid their fee, and returned with a traditional, ambiguous verse about reaping the bounty of the earth under the watchful eye of the crown. It was interpreted as a cautious blessing for both the harvest and the magistrate's new levy. The village prepared to pay, but when the magistrate's tax collectors arrived, they were not followed by carts to carry the grain. They carried only large, empty linen sacks, expecting the villagers to fill them on the spot. A heated argument erupted. The collectors insisted this was the procedure, but the villagers, remembering Mycon's exact words about empty sacks, saw it as a blatant attempt to take more than the agreed share by forcing them to overfill loose sacks. They refused, citing the farmer's omen as divine justification. The resulting standoff escalated to the regional governor, who investigated and found the magistrate had indeed planned to exploit the vague wording of the traditional tax code. The levy was suspended. In the village, a quiet revolution occurred. The farmer's silly bird had been precisely correct, while the expensive official prophecy from Delphi had been uselessly vague, even misleading. People began bringing small offerings to Mycon's farm, seeking advice on everything from marriage prospects to lost goats. The local priest of Apollo was furious, his authority and his share of sacrificial offerings dwindling by the day. He denounced Mycon as a fraud and the hoopoe as a demon, but the villagers who had seen their pockets saved by the farmer were not convinced. This tension between the grand state oracle and the humble folk omen was a constant undercurrent in Greek life. Delphi dealt in the fate of empires, its language poetic and distant, folk divination reading the flights of birds, the patterns of smoke, or the entrails of a sacrificed chicken, was immediate, personal, and spoke in the local dialect. The establishment saw these practices as superstitious, even dangerous, because they bypassed the entire religious and political hierarchy. A farmer with a prophetic bird did not pay consultation fees, did not need an interpreter, and owed no allegiance to any power but his own community. The crisis in that Boeotian village was microcosmic. It asked a dangerous question: what if the gods spoke more clearly through a common hoopoe than through the smoke of the sacred tripod? The priesthood's real fear was not that the farmer was wrong, but that he might be right, revealing that divine access was not their exclusive privilege after all. Silence can be a more devastating prophecy than any verse. In the year 546 before the Common Era, the tyrant of Corinth, a man named Periander, son of Cypselus, stood in the dim light of the Aditon at Delphi. He was one of the most powerful and feared rulers in Greece, a patron of the arts and a master of brutal political control. He had come not as a humble supplicant, but as a client expecting a service. His reign, built on intimidation and violence, faced growing whispers of dissent. He needed the stamp of divine approval, a public prophecy from Apollo himself that would legitimize his rule and silence his critics. The customary sacrifices were made, the silver paid. The Pythia was led in, washed in the Castalian spring, and seated upon the sacred tripod. The priests awaited the familiar signs, the trembling, the altered voice, the cryptic words rising from the chasm. But this time nothing happened. The priestess did not tremble. She did not chant or cry out. She simply sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the tyrant standing before her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the sacred laurel leaves on the brazier. Then, without a sound, the Pythia stood up. She turned her back on the most powerful man in the room and walked out of the Aditon, leaving the holy space empty. The divine mute button had been pressed. For a tyrant like Periander, this was not a neutral event, it was a cataclysm. In a world where every natural sign was interpreted, the refusal of the god to speak was the loudest possible condemnation. It was a public, sacred rejection. Imagine the scene: the confused and terrified priests, the stunned entourage, and the tyrant himself, standing alone in the sudden vacuum of divine authority he had come to claim. The political and religious implications were terrifying. News of this silent rebuke would spread like wildfire, emboldening his enemies and stripping his reign of its last shred of celestial legitimacy. A ruler who could not even buy a word from Apollo was, in the eyes of his people, a ruler standing outside the favor of the cosmos. We know from historical fragments that Periander's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and legendary cruelty. Stories of burning the fine clothes of Corinth's women to humble them, of sending 300 boys to be castrated in a single act of vengeance. While these tales may be exaggerated, they paint a portrait of a man consumed by suspicion and the need for absolute control. The silence at Delphi did not cause his cruelty, but it likely poisoned his mind with a divine confirmation of his deepest fear, that his power was inherently illegitimate, a hollow shell that even the gods would not bless. That empty Aditon echoed in his psyche louder than any battle cry. The oracle's power was never just in speaking, it was also in the terrifying, world-altering decision to say nothing at all, to leave a tyrant alone with the echo of his own ambition. The tyrant's silent treatment was a political death sentence, but some prophetic voices thrived outside the walls of any sanctuary altogether. They were the Sibyls, wandering women who carried the divine fire within them, answerable to no priesthood and bound to no temple. Their prophecies were raw, ecstatic, and terrifyingly mobile. One such figure arrived at the bustling port of Pythias, the harbor of Athens, her hair wild and her eyes burning with an inner light. She stood in the agora not as a supplicant but as a vessel and began to speak. But the words that poured forth were not Greek. They were a torrent of chaotic sounds, a divine glossolalia of guttural cries, musical syllables, and rasping whispers that seemed to hold no human grammar. The gathered crowd was fascinated but baffled. Some saw it as a sign of madness, others as a genuine but inaccessible message from the gods. The city's official interpreters were summoned, but they could only shrug, declaring the speech a pure, untranslatable mystery of divine possession. The prophecy seemed destined to be recorded as mere noise, a curious event with no meaning. Then, from the very edge of the crowd, a slave who had been hauling amphorae froze. He was a man from a small, conquered tribe in the distant hinterlands of Thrace, sold into bondage years before. The Sibyl's torrent of sound was not nonsense to him. Woven into the frenzy were distinct words, phrases from his own nearly extinct native tongue, a language no Greek in that square would have recognized. He heard the word for White Mountain, the name for River of Three Forks, and the verb to return home. Driven by a shock of recognition that cut through his station, he pushed forward. He did not dare address the Sibyl or the magistrates. Instead, he began translating in a low, urgent voice to the slaves and foreigners standing near him, piecing together the fragments. The message was not for Athens. It was horrifyingly specific. It spoke of a coming landslide on the White Mountain that would block the three-forked river, causing it to flood the valley where his people still lived. But it also gave a precise location for a safe cave system higher up, a place known only in the old songs of his childhood. The prophecy was a warning and a salvation guide for a people the Greek world considered barbarians and had long forgotten. This event cracks open a profound distinction in ancient prophecy. The institutional oracles like Delphi worked to make the divine intelligible, filtering ecstatic revelation through ritual and poetry into formal hexameter verses for the powerful. The Sibyl's power was the opposite. It was the unfiltered, ecstatic cry, a language of pure emotion and divine urgency that bypassed reason entirely. Her message was not crafted for political consumption. It was broadcast like a signal, and its meaning depended entirely on who had the code to receive it. In this case, the code was a dying language known only to the marginalized. The slave, the lowest person in that social hierarchy, became the sole interpreter of a god's will because the god had chosen to speak in the tongue of the forgotten. The implications are staggering. It suggests that divine messages could be targeted, that oracles could speak past empires and city-states directly to the edges of the known world. The slave's translation was an act of incredible courage, but it also created a dilemma. What could he do with this knowledge? He was property, unable to travel. According to the legend, he convinced a sympathetic foreign merchant moved by the story to carry the warning north. Whether it arrived in time, history does not say. But the story itself survived as a testament to a haunting idea, that the gods might not always speak the language of the powerful. Sometimes they whisper the future in the forgotten words of the enslaved, ensuring that even those with no voice in the halls of power might still hear a warning meant for them alone. A soaring eagle could hold the fate of an empire, but its shadow also fell upon the humble athlete. On a dusty road leading from the city of Argos to the sacred site of Olympia, a young wrestler named Damagoras walked with his father and trainer. The journey was a pilgrimage in itself, a final test of discipline before the greatest contest of his life. As they neared the Alpheus River, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a massive golden eagle, a bird sacred to Zeus, king of the gods and patron of the games, plunged from the sky. Its target was a serpent gliding through the tall grass. In a flash of talons, the eagle snatched the writhing snake and soared upward. But then, instead of carrying its prize away, the eagle released it. The serpent fell not onto the open earth, but directly onto the path just ahead, landing with a soft thud in the dust before the chariot of a rival athlete from a powerful, hostile city. The chariot wheels rolled over the dead snake without pause. Damagoras and his father stood frozen, awestruck by the violent public omen. they immediately sought out a local augur, a seer skilled in interpreting the will of the gods through bird signs. The old man listened intently, his eyes closed. When he spoke, his voice was firm. The eagle, the symbol of Zeus, had chosen its prey, the serpent, a creature often representing cunning, earth-bound power, or chaos. By snatching it from the ground, the eagle demonstrated divine supremacy. But the critical moment was the release, by dropping the conquered serpent directly into the path of the rival, and having that rival's chariot unknowingly crush it. The omen was unmistakable. It signified that Zeus himself would deliver Damogoras' opposition into his hands, to be overcome as surely as the wheels crushed the snake. The victory was not just predicted, it was dramatized by the gods. Heart-pounding with a mixture of terror and elation, Damogoras entered the games. The wrestling matches were grueling, a test of strength, skill, and sheer endurance under the brutal summer sun. When the brackets were set, Damogoras found himself facing the very athlete whose chariot had rolled over the serpent. The omen hung in the air between them. According to the tale, the match was fiercely contested, but Damogoras fought with a transcendent confidence, as if the strength of the eagle itself flowed through him. He triumphed, pinning his rival's shoulders to the earth, a human reenactment of the aerial drama he had witnessed. He went on to win the entire competition, crowned with the sacred olive wreath. This story reveals the intricate, living language of augury. For ancient seers, every detail mattered: the species of bird, its direction of flight, the type of prey, the location of the drop, and the reaction of any witnesses. A bird flying from the left, the auspicious side, might mean one thing, while the same bird flying from the right could mean the opposite. The eagle was always a potent sign of Zeus, but its action determined the message. Carrying prey to a city's walls was a sign of protection. Dropping it was a sign of divine judgment. Damogoras' victory was not seen as a coincidence. It was a narrative written in the sky, a short, brutal play performed by animals that spelled out his destiny in a symbolic language every Greek understood. The gods were not silent observers, they were active directors, using the natural world as their stage to send scripts of triumph and warning to those who knew how to watch. Beneath the sanctioned prayers for victory and health flowed a darker, parallel current of human desire. For those who believed the gods could grant a blessing, it was a small step to believe they could also deliver a curse. At certain oracles dedicated to the chthonic or underworld deities like Persephone and Hades, this shadow service was an open secret. A petitioner would pay the priests to inscribe a lead tablet with a specific, malicious incantation, often binding or crippling a rival in love, law, or commerce. The tablet was then ritually killed with a nail driven through it and deposited into a sacred pit or well, a direct line to the vengeful powers below. One such story, whispered for generations, involves a prosperous potter from the city of Corinth. His business was thriving until a former apprentice, a man of remarkable skill and ambition, set up a rival workshop across the street. The new shop quickly began drawing away the potter's best clients with superior designs and lower prices. Consumed by envy and fear of ruin, the potter traveled to a remote sanctuary of the earth goddess Demeter and her daughter, a place known for its merciless judgments. He paid a substantial sum for a powerful curse tablet. The text was viciously specific. It called upon the underworld gods to bind the rival's hands so they would tremble and break his pots at the wheel, to strike him with a wasting fever, and to ensure his business crumbled into dust. The ritual was performed at midnight. The priest nailed the tablet and dropped it into a dark, bottomless-looking fissure in the sanctuary's stone floor. The potter returned home, expecting to watch his rival's slow, divinely ordained destruction. Instead, the calamity visited his own doorstep. Within days, his beloved daughter was seized by a sudden, violent fever. His own hands, steady for decades, began to shake inexplicably while working, ruining batch after batch of his finest wares. Then, one night, a fire sparked in his own kiln room, spreading quickly and consuming his workshop, home, and most of his unsold inventory. He was left destitute and heartbroken, nursing his sick child in the ashes of his life. The priests at the chthonic sanctuary, when news reached them, offered a terrifying interpretation. The gods of the underworld were not mere contractors for human malice. They were ancient moral powers who saw the true nature of every plea sent into their darkness. In this case, they had judged the potter's envy as unjust, his curse an attempt to punish talent and fair competition. His payment and ritual were accepted, but the divine justice he invoked was turned completely back upon its sender. His own hands were bound, his own household was struck with illness, and his own business was literally reduced to ashes. This story reveals a profound and widespread ancient belief that the machinery of divine power had a built-in moral compass. A curse was not a neutral tool, it was a plea for cosmic violence, and the gods who received it reserved the right to examine the petitioner's soul. If the cause was found wanting, the curse would boomerang with dreadful precision. This belief acted as a powerful social deterrent, making one think twice before seeking supernatural vengeance. It acknowledged that while humans could be petty and vindictive, the forces governing the universe ultimately favored a deeper, if often inscrutable, balance. To invoke those forces for a selfish, unjust cause was to risk having the entire terrible weight of their judgment land squarely on your own head. The dark fissure in the earth did not just send messages down, it sometimes sent a fatal reply back up. The moral boomerang of a curse revealed a universe with its own grim justice, but the reach of the Greek oracles extended far beyond the Aegean world. Across the Ionian Sea, in the wealthy and mysterious land of Etruria, a powerful king named Lars Porsena ruled from his hilltop city. His civilization was renowned for its sophisticated art, engineering, and a unique form of divination, hepatoscopy, the practice of reading the will of the gods in the livers of sacrificed animals. To legitimize his ambitious building projects and centralize his authority, Porsena sought a blessing from the most prestigious spiritual authority he knew of, the Oracle of Delphi. His delegation did not arrive with simple gold or silver. They carried a breathtakingly specific votive offering, a perfect, life-sized model of a sheep's liver, meticulously cast in bronze. This was no arbitrary gift. It was a map of his people's soul, a symbolic key to their entire method of communicating with the divine. The intricate bronze liver was divided into sections corresponding to the regions of the sky and the domains of various Etruscan gods, a tangible encyclopedia of their belief system. The message was clear. The Etruscan king was asking the Greek god Apollo to examine and validate the very framework of his rule and his people's piety. The priests of Delphi, faced with this foreign theological artifact, were undoubtedly stunned. They consulted the Pythia. Her response, filtered through Etruscan translators and recorded by accompanying scribes, did not comment on politics or war. Instead, it focused on the object itself. The prophecy suggested that while the map was exquisitely made, the true God sought the living flame upon the altar, not the cold metal of its image. It advised the king to look to the consistency of the sacred signs in his own land, to standardize the rituals so that every priest in every city interpreted the trembling organs in the same way. When the delegation returned to Etruria, Porsena took this Delphic advice to heart. He used it to launch a major religious reform, codifying the practice of hepatoscopy across his realm. This created a unified state religion under his control, strengthening his political power by standardizing the language of the gods themselves. The Greek oracle, in a single consultation, had helped reshape the spiritual landscape of a foreign civilization. Centuries later, modern archaeology would provide stunning physical proof of this deep cultural exchange. In Etruscan tombs and sanctuary ruins across Italy, archaeologists have unearthed artifacts inscribed with texts that are unmistakably Greek oracular responses. These are not mere copies, they are treasured objects, often etched onto precious bronze mirrors or sheets of gold placed in the graves of nobles. One famous example is the Pythias tablets, gold foils discovered at an Etruscan port, which contain a dedication in both Etruscan and Phoenician to the goddess Astarte, referencing a foundation guided by an oracular command. The phrasing echoes the formal structure of Greek prophetic decrees. These artifacts tell a silent but powerful story. For the Etruscans, a Greek prophecy was not distant news. It was a piece of portable divine wisdom, a sacred technology to be owned, studied, and integrated into their own worldview. They collected and preserved these pronouncements, translating them and likely adapting their meanings to local contexts. This transforms our understanding of the oracle's influence. They were not just advising Greek colonists or occasional foreign kings. They were actively contributing to the theological and intellectual foundation of another great culture. The prophecies became cross-cultural commodities, their authority recognized and repurposed far from their source. The bronze liver and the golden tablets are two sides of the same coin, one a question sent to Greece in the language of Etruscan belief, the other an answer brought home and woven into the fabric of Etruscan life. This dialogue across the Mediterranean proves that the voice from Delphi was considered a universal standard of divine truth, a spiritual currency accepted even by those who prayed to entirely different gods. A divine command could forge a king's religion, but it could also ignite the birth of an entire philosophy. In the heart of Athens, a man named Socrates, known for his relentless questioning, faced a crisis of purpose. He had spent years interrogating the city's most respected citizens, exposing the gaps in their knowledge and earning a reputation as a troublesome gadfly. Yet he himself claimed to know nothing. To find direction, he sent his closest friend, Chaerephon, to the Oracle of Delphi with a direct and personal question: is anyone wiser than Socrates? The Pythias' response was unequivocal: no one. This pronouncement, rather than inflating his ego, plunged Socrates into profound confusion. How could he, who knew his own ignorance, be declared the wisest of all? He saw the oracle's words not as a compliment, but as a divine riddle to be solved, a paradox sent by Apollo himself. He embarked on a mission to test the oracle, interviewing politicians, poets, and craftsmen, only to confirm that while they believed they knew much, they knew far less than they thought. Socrates finally interpreted the god's meaning. True wisdom belongs to the god alone, but human wisdom is worth little. The wisest human is the one who, like Socrates, understands the limits of his own knowledge. This single oracular statement did not give him a system of thought, it gave him a method. The entire Socratic practice of dialectic, the relentless questioning that seeks not to lecture but to expose ignorance and clarify ideas, was born from this attempt to understand a divine pronouncement. The oracle provided the foundational axiom, "Know that you do not know." Socrates built the entire architecture of critical inquiry upon it. This story represents a breathtaking collision between two worlds, the world of divine revelation and the world of human reason. The oracle did not hand down a philosophical treatise, it issued a catalytic spark. It presented a truth that reason was then compelled to unpack, verify, and systematize. In this dialogue, revelation posed the question, and philosophy dedicated itself to finding the answer through logic and debate. The god's voice was the seed, and Socratic inquiry was the complex, living tree that grew from it. This reframes the oracle's role in intellectual history. It was not an opponent of philosophy, but in this crucial instance, its improbable midwife. A single sentence from a priestess in a trance became the bedrock for a revolution in human thought, proving that the most profound ideas sometimes begin not with an argument, but with a sacred, bewildering command. The foundation stone of a temple is meant to be a permanent promise to the gods, not a secret message. Yet in the ruins of a sanctuary dedicated to Artemis on the island of Samos, archaeologists uncovered a marble block with a seemingly straightforward dedicatory inscription. It listed the names of the wealthy donors who funded the temple's construction and praised the goddess for her protection. For decades, it was catalogued as a standard example of pious gratitude. But a graduate student, centuries later, was transcribing the text for a digital database when she noticed a peculiar pattern in the spacing of the Greek letters. On a whim, she isolated the first letter of each line of verse and wrote them down in sequence. The random letters suddenly formed a coherent, chilling sentence in ancient Greek. It read, "The flame that consecrates shall also consume." This was not a blessing, it was a prediction of the temple's own destruction by fire. The hidden message was a perfect acrostic prophecy, woven into the very fabric of the temple's public identity. Who would dare to encode such a dire warning into a monument meant to last forever, and why? The most compelling theory points not to a disgruntled worker, but to the head priestess of the sanctuary at the time of construction. Historical records suggest she was a woman of immense learning and independent wealth, who often clashed with the ruling tyrant of Samos, a man named Polycrates. Polycrates was famous for his grandiose building projects, using them to cement his power and legacy. The new temple to Artemis was his pet project, a symbol of his piety and control. The priestess, however, had received ominous signs during the foundation rituals, perhaps from the flight of birds or the entrails of a sacrifice, that the temple would not stand under his rule. To speak this prophecy aloud would have been treason, a direct challenge to the tyrant's authority and an act that could doom the sanctuary itself. But to bury it silently in the stone was an act of profound, secret fidelity to the goddess. She ensured that the truth of the temple's fate was recorded not for the present but for the future, for a time when the political power that built it had crumbled to dust. It was a divine signature, a whisper from the goddess herself, etched in code for posterity to discover only after the predicted event had come to pass. And history records that the magnificent temple did indeed burn to the ground in a great fire during a period of political upheaval, long after the priestess and the tyrant were gone. The hidden acrostic transforms the stone from a monument to human pride into a timeless vessel for a truth too dangerous for its own age. It asks us who the inscription was truly for, the public who admired its surface, or the ages who would one day decipher its secret heart. Water itself could become a divine mouthpiece. While most oracles relied on priests or priestesses, a few sacred sites offered a more direct, elemental form of prophecy. In the rugged region of Achaea near the coast lay the Oracle of Heracles at Bura. Here there was no temple in the traditional sense. The power resided in a particular spring that fed into a small, swift river. Seekers would come not to hear a human interpreter but to watch the water itself. They practiced hydromancy, divination by observing the movements, colors, and reflections in the flowing stream. In times of normal flow, priests might interpret patterns of bubbles or the way leaves swirled in eddies, but the most powerful prophecies were said to come unbidden in moments of extreme natural imbalance. One such legend is tied to a devastating multi-year drought that gripped the region. Crops withered in the fields, livestock grew thin, and the people of Bura watched their life-giving river shrink day by day until it was little more than a chain of muddy puddles baking in the sun. In a final act of collective desperation, the entire community marched to the source spring, offering sacrifices and pleading with Heracles, the divine hero associated with strength and endurance, for a sign. They gathered around the nearly dry springhead, a silent, cracked depression in the stone. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as the sun reached its peak, a deep, groaning rumble echoed from the earth beneath their feet. From the parched stone, not muddy sludge, but a torrent of shockingly clear, cold water erupted, surging forth with such force it immediately filled the old riverbed and overflowed its banks. The people stumbled back, awestruck and drenched, but the miracle was not just the water's return. As the initial surge settled into a strong, steady flow, those kneeling closest to the spring swore they saw shapes forming in the churning surface, not reflections of the sky, but distinct images, fleeting yet clear. Some claimed to see sheaves of wheat bending under their own weight. Others saw the outlines of ships with full sails entering the harbor. A low, harmonious sound seemed to rise with the water's murmur, not quite voices, but a resonant hum that many interpreted as a single word: abundance. The message was immediate and profound. The drought was broken, and the coming years would bring not just recovery, but unprecedented prosperity from both land and sea. True to the water's vision, the rains returned that very winter. The following harvest was legendary, and trade routes by sea opened new wealth for the city. This event cemented the oracle's reputation for centuries. To understand why a spring could speak, we must dive into the sacred geography of the Greek world. Springs and rivers were never just sources of water, they were living connections to the divine. They emerged mysteriously from the underworld, the realm of hidden knowledge and the dead. Many were guarded by nymphs, minor goddesses who were the spirits of the place itself. To drink from or see a vision in such water was to receive knowledge from the earth's deepest memory. The clarity of the spring at Bura was especially significant. Murky water might signify hidden danger or confusion, but water that ran clear was seen as a conduit for truth, a liquid mirror that could, in rare moments of divine favor, reflect the future itself. The Oracle of Heracles did not need a priest to translate, because in those extraordinary moments, the natural world itself became the prophet, and the entire community stood as witness to a promise written not in verse, but in the life-giving surge of a sacred spring. A common soldier's faith was often as simple as a piece of cheap lead. In the crowded market outside a shrine to Apollo in Ionia, a young hoplite named Leon, his nerves frayed before his first major battle, fumbled with a few small coins. He bypassed the expensive silver amulets and chose instead a simple, mass-produced token from a vendor's tray. It was a thin disc of lead, stamped on one side with a crude image of a helmet and spear, and on the other with a few lines of tiny, hastily pressed Greek letters. He couldn't read them. To Leon, it didn't matter. The token was a physical piece of hope, a tangible God favor he could clutch in his palm as the phalanx lines closed. He wore it on a leather thong around his neck through a dozen skirmishes and 3 major battles. He watched men fall to his left and right, yet he emerged each time with only minor wounds, his luck holding. Over years, his steady nerve and survival brought promotions until he commanded a small garrison on a quiet island in his later years. The token remained, a worn, smooth lump against his chest, its inscription a forgotten mystery. During a visit from a retired scholar turned tax assessor, an old man with a fondness for antiquities, Leon finally had a moment of curiosity. Over a cup of wine, he pulled the token from his tunic and asked if the scholar could make out the faded letters. The old man cleaned the lead, held it to the light, and his eyebrows rose. He read it aloud slowly. The text was not a generic prayer for safety or victory. It was startlingly specific. It named no names, but it outlined a life path. It spoke of a youth who would face the bronze tide and not drown. It described a man who would carry the weight of many and find rest where the sea is calm and the earth yields olives. The scholar looked at Leon, at his veteran's bearing and his current peaceful post overlooking a tranquil harbor and an olive grove. The prophecy, pressed into cheap lead a lifetime ago, had charted his entire journey from the chaos of the bronze-clad battle line to the command of others, to this very moment of quiet retirement. The shock was profound. That mass-produced charm, one of hundreds sold to anxious men that day, contained a script written for him alone. This story cracks open a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of ancient spirituality, the industrial scale of hope. Shrines were not just places of profound mystery, they were bustling economic centers. Priests sanctioned vendors to sell these pre-inscribed tokens, prayers, and curses to a ready market of pilgrims. For most buyers, they were exactly what Leon believed them to be: standardized good luck charms, a ritual purchase to ease the mind. The inscriptions were often formulaic, blessings copied by the hundred. But the belief system held that even a mass-produced prayer, once purchased and dedicated by an individual, became personally activated. The divine could, in theory, see the specific hand that held it. In Leon's case, the eerie accuracy of the text suggests something more, perhaps a sly priest with a keen eye for character, watching the young soldier's demeanor and selling him a token from a special batch, or simply the incredible power of coincidence shaped by a lifetime of interpretation. The delayed understanding is key. Had Leon known the prophecy as a youth, it might have made him reckless or fearful, trying to live up to or avoid a predetermined path. Instead, he lived his life authentically. The prophecy's power lay in its retrospective revelation, turning a life of chance and choice into a story that felt divinely authored, a narrative he could only read after he had already lived it. It asks a haunting question: does a prophecy have more power when we discover it has been quietly guiding us all along, or when we use it to try and steer our course? For Leon, the humble lead token transformed from a purchased comfort into the archive of his own soul, a map he only understood once the journey was complete. The worn lead token promised a soldier's peaceful end, but some prophecies foretold an end for the very institutions that spoke them. At a small, windswept sanctuary of Apollo in the remote hills of Arcadia, a young priest in training was tasked with transcribing the day's consultations onto fresh papyrus. One response, given to a shepherd asking about the safety of his flocks for the coming winter, was unusually long and vivid. It spoke of protecting the sheep from wolves and harsh storms, but then, in its final lines, the vision swerved violently. It described a great, roaring beast of flame that would descend from the northern sky, a beast with 100 glowing eyes that would devour the sacred laurel grove, crack the temple's columns like dry twigs, and leave the sanctuary a silent, blackened scar upon the earth. The young priest paused, his stylus hovering. He showed the passage to the high priest, who read it with a frown. The old man shook his head. This was clearly symbolic, he explained. The beast of flame represented a fierce winter blizzard from the north. The glowing eyes were the sleet and hail that would strip the trees. The destruction of the temple was merely a metaphor for the sanctuary being closed and inaccessible during the deep snows. They filed the prophecy under the shepherd's name and thought little more of it. Decades passed. The shepherd lived out his life, the sanctuary thrived, and the strange, fiery prophecy gathered dust in the archives. Then, on a calm autumn night, a meteor storm of unprecedented intensity lit up the northern horizon. Witnesses from nearby villages described it as 100 burning coals streaking across the sky. One large, blazing fragment, a roaring beast of flame with a long, glowing tail, did not burn up in the atmosphere. It struck the hillside directly on the sanctuary of Apollo. The impact and subsequent fire incinerated the sacred grove, shattered the marble columns with explosive force, and left the entire site a smoldering, glassy crater. The event matched the forgotten prophecy in every chilling detail: the direction, the imagery of the 100 eyes, the specific destruction of the grove and columns. The priests had interpreted the oracle's words through the only lens they had: the cyclical, predictable threats of their world: winter storms, wolves, and human conflict. The prophecy, however, was literal. It came from a perspective outside of time, describing an event so far outside human experience that it could only be understood as metaphor until the moment it arrived. This reveals a haunting layer to the Greek concept of fate. Time was not always a straight line for them. It was often seen as a great turning wheel where seasons, lives, and even the rise and fall of cities followed predictable, repeating cycles. Oracles excelled at navigating this wheel, seeing the patterns of human ambition and natural consequence. But the meteor was not part of any cycle. It was a singular, random, cosmic accident. The oracle, in its trance state, had momentarily pierced through the wheel of cyclical time, and glimpsed the linear, chaotic truth of a universe that could produce absolute, meaningless endings. The prophecy was a message in a bottle from the future, describing its own point of origin's ruin. It forces a terrifying question: what is it like for a vessel of divine knowledge to foresee its own annihilation? To know that the sacred ground you stand upon, the rituals you perform, the very breath you use to channel the god, will one day be erased by a force that cares nothing for prayers or tradition. This meta-prophecy acknowledges a profound limit. The oracle could see the end, but it could not prevent it. The institution was mortal. Its power was vast, but it existed within a cosmos that could, without malice or meaning, simply reach down and snuff it out. The voice that spoke for the gods was in the end just a voice, and even the gods' own houses could burn. The cosmic fire that erased one sanctuary reminds us that even divine voices were carried by fragile human vessels. For every famous prophecy that shaped empires, there were countless whispered words that never left the village. The Pythia of Delphi, when the sacred fumes cleared and the last ambassador had departed, would remove her ceremonial headdress and return to her own home. In one such village nestled in the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a particular priestess was known not just for her divine office, but for her profound earthly wisdom. After her official duties, women from the surrounding farms and workshops would find quiet ways to seek her counsel. They came not with questions of state, but with the raw, personal crises that history ignores: a husband's wasting illness, a daughter's dangerous childbirth, a bitter feud over a property boundary. The Pythia, whose name may have been Myrto, would listen in the shade of her own olive tree, far from the temple's grandeur. She offered no trance-induced verses here, only the hard-earned insight of a woman who had peered into the abyss of the god and returned. She might suggest a specific local herb for a fever that the town physician had missed, or recommend a way to phrase a difficult conversation to avoid a kinsman's pride. Her advice was practical, compassionate, and deeply rooted in the shared experience of womanhood in a world that offered them little official power. She became the secret architect of peace in dozens of households, her true legacy written not in stone, but in the stability of families and the survival of children. This hidden role reveals a vital truth: the woman who channeled the god for kings was also a repository of community wisdom, using the authority of her position to heal in quiet, intimate ways the official oracle never could. If one woman used her sacred role to empower others privately, another was forced to steal a role to save her people publicly. In a city-state constantly on the brink of war, the ruling council decreed that only male citizens could consult the oracle on matters of military strategy. The wife of a recently captured general, a woman named Delphi, believed she knew the location of a secret mountain pass that could be used for a rescue, but she needed divine sanction to convince the skeptical, grieving council. Daring everything, she cut her hair short, bound her chest, and practiced walking with the swagger of a young soldier. In the crowded, anonymous lines of seekers at Delphi, her disguise held. When her turn came, she deepened her voice and asked, in the formal language of a military scout, about the viability of a mountain route for a special troop movement. The Pythia, perhaps sensing the desperate heart beneath the masculine garb, gave an unusually clear response: the goat path becomes the road of salvation when the eagle's shadow falls at dawn. It was the confirmation Elpis needed, a poetic nod to the high, treacherous trails where only goats climbed, and the eagle's shadow, likely referring to a specific peak that caught the first morning light. She returned home triumphant, the prophecy scroll in hand, and immediately revealed her identity and her plan to the council. The revelation caused an uproar. Some elders were outraged at the deception, a violation of sacred and civic law. Others, particularly the soldiers loyal to her captured husband, were galvanized by the risk she had taken and the clarity of the oracle she had won. The prophecy itself became the center of a furious debate. Was it invalidated by the seeker's fraud, or did the god, in his omniscience, knowingly give the answer to the true heart behind the disguise? After days of turmoil, the rescue mission was approved, not because the council accepted her, but because the men could not ignore the perfect strategic sense of her plan, now backed by a divine utterance. The mission succeeded, her husband was freed, and the city celebrated, yet Elpis was never formally honored. The official records credited the prophecy to an anonymous patriot. Her story survives in fragments, a testament to the brutal bind women faced. Their insight was necessary, but their voice was forbidden unless cloaked in a lie. The oracle, in this instance, became an unwitting accomplice to that deception, its authority used to bypass the very laws that sought to control access to it. This duality is haunting. The same institution that empowered a Pythia like Myrto to be a village sage also forced a woman like Elpis to become a masterful impostor just to be heard. One operated in the soft power of the private sphere, the other had to storm the gates of the public one in disguise, and both reveal that the real magic often happened not in the gods' cryptic words, but in the human courage required to seek them. The temple's foundation stone held a secret for the ages, but its very orientation whispered a truth to the heavens. For decades, archaeologists meticulously mapped the ruins of Delphi, charting every column base and fallen pediment. They assumed the temple's alignment was purely topographical, following the natural curve of the mountain slope for dramatic effect. Then, a surveyor with an interest in archaeoastronomy overlaid the temple's precise axis onto a star chart for the year of its construction. The line did not point to a neighboring peak or a sacred spring. It pointed directly to the spot on the horizon where the constellation Draco's brightest star, Theban, would have risen at dawn on the autumn equinox 2,500 years ago. This was no accident. Theban was the pole star of the ancient Egyptian world, a symbol of cosmic constancy and divine order, knowledge that Greek architects and priests would have encountered through trade and travel. The sanctuary was a clock, and the cosmos held the key. This discovery rippled through other major oracular sites. At Didyma, the colossal temple of Apollo was found to be oriented so that on the summer solstice, the year's longest day, the first rays of the rising sun would shoot directly down the entire length of its 300-foot sacred way, through the open eastern doors, and illuminate the dark inner chamber, the Aditon, where the priestess would receive her visions. At the Oracle of Zeus at Dodona, the sacred oak grove was planted within a natural bowl aligned with the winter solstice sunrise, a day symbolizing rebirth and the return of light. The architects were not merely builders, they were celestial programmers, encoding a calendar of divine appointments into stone and landscape. They understood that prophecy was not just a psychological or chemical event, it was an ecological and astronomical one. The power of place was amplified by the power of time, specifically sacred time. This leads to a radical, untold theory about the mechanics of the trance itself. We have spoken of intoxicating vapors and potent brews, but what if these were just one part of a meticulously staged ritual? Imagine the scene at Delphi on that targeted autumn morning. The Pythia has fasted and bathed. She descends into the dim, underground Aditon, a space already charged with the reported geological gases, the high priest's weight. As the sun crests the ridge, its light, aligned by the temple's axis, does not directly hit the chamber, which was windowless. Instead, it strikes a highly polished bronze shield or disc, strategically placed on an outer altar. A sliver of that intensified, reflected light is then directed down a narrow shaft or through a specially designed aperture in the wall. At the precise moment the star Theban breaks the horizon, a single, brilliant beam of coppery light lances through the smoky darkness of the cave, striking the bowl of holy water or the laurel leaves beside the tripod, creating a dazzling, moving pattern on the wall. For the Pythia, already in a sensitized state from fasting and anticipation, This sudden, timed, celestial intrusion would be profoundly disorienting. The flickering, otherworldly light, combined with the fumes and the chanting, could easily tip her mind across the threshold from ritual into full visionary trance. The prophecy, then, becomes an event choreographed by the cosmos itself, a moment where earth and sky conspired to open a door to the divine. The architect's alignment guaranteed that the god's house would be in session on the most potent days of the cosmic year, turning the oracle from a seasonal service into a celestial performance. The priests were not just interpreting the god's words, they were literally setting the stage for his arrival, using the sun and stars as their curtain call. A recurring dream can be more terrifying than any waking omen. For a Corinthian merchant named Philon, it was the same vision night after night. He saw his own ship, the Dolphin's Grace, laden with fine pottery and silver ingots sailing under a clear sky. Then, without warning, the sea would boil black. Jagged rocks, unseen beneath the waves, would tear the hull open like parchment. He would wake gasping, tasting salt, the screams of his crew echoing in his silent bedroom. He consulted dream interpreters in the city agora, but their readings were contradictory. Some said it symbolized a business venture tearing apart. Others dismissed it as bad fish from supper. Yet the dream's visceral, specific horror would not fade. With a season's profit at stake and his own sanity fraying, Philon did what any prudent Greek would do when personal intuition clashed with mortal uncertainty. He booked passage to Delphi. His question was not about profit margins or market trends. It was raw and simple. He asked the Pythia if the dream was a true warning from the gods or merely the phantom of his own fear. The response he received was both a validation and a lifeline. The Pythia, in her traditional hexameter verse, first confirmed the dream's divine origin. She spoke of Poseidon's black teeth hidden beneath the smiling sea, a direct echo of the submerged rocks in his nightmare, but then she added the crucial, saving detail the dream itself had withheld. She described a crescent bay guarded by twin hawks, a safe harbor a short sail to the east of the wreck site. She gave a specific landmark, a waterfall that poured directly onto a beach of black sand, a place he could use to verify the location. Philon's terror transformed into focused action. He returned to Corinth and immediately altered his shipping plans. He sent the Dolphin's Grace on its usual route, but with new, explicit orders for his captain. They were to sail well south of the suspected danger zone, then work their way up the coast, searching for the waterfall on black sand. It took weeks of anxious waiting, but when his ship finally returned, the news was staggering. The captain reported finding the exact bay, complete with the waterfall. More importantly, from local fishermen, he learned the name of the deadly reef his dream had shown him, a place called the Sailor's Maw, infamous among locals but uncharted on Greek maps. By avoiding it, they had not only saved the ship, but they had also discovered something far more valuable: a safe, deep-water harbor on a coastline previously considered too treacherous for regular trade. Philon's divine warning became the foundation of a commercial empire. He established a small trading post at that crescent bay, a way station where other Greek ships could resupply and avoid the Maw. This post grew into a permanent colony, creating a new, safer sea lane that funneled exotic goods, timber, and dyes directly to Corinth through his network. His wealth multiplied, but he always credited the Oracle, sending a magnificent bronze tripod to Delphi inscribed with a simple phrase: "From a dream's wreckage, a harbor was built." This story illuminates a profoundly practical, often overlooked function of the oracles. They were the ancient world's premier risk management consultants. In an era without insurance, reliable maps, or weather forecasts, long-distance trade was an act of faith bordering on madness. A merchant risked his entire fortune and his life on every voyage. The Oracle did not guarantee success, but it provided something arguably more valuable: a framework for decision-making in the face of paralyzing uncertainty. By validating an intuitive fear, it gave Philon the confidence to act against conventional wisdom. By providing a specific, verifiable detail, it turned a vague warning into an actionable strategy. The gods in this reading were not just masters of fate, they were partners in enterprise, their cryptic advice serving as the seed capital for new markets and the invisible safety net that made colossal economic risks worth taking. The gleaming treasures in Delphi's treasuries were not just thank-you gifts, they were dividends paid on divine intelligence. The merchant's dream-built harbor shows how the oracles shaped the future, but every voice, no matter how divine, has its final word. Our 30th and final untold story is not one of triumph or cryptic salvation, but of a profound and poetic silence. In the 4th century of the Common Era, the world the oracles had helped build for 1,000 years was crumbling. Christianity, backed by imperial power, was systematically dismantling the old pagan order. Temples were being closed, their treasures confiscated, their rituals banned. Yet in this twilight, a flicker of the old faith remained. The last pagan emperor, a man named Julian, often called the apostate for his attempt to reverse the Christian tide, clung to the ancient ways. On the eve of a major military campaign against Persia, he sought the ultimate validation, a prophecy from the most revered source of all. He sent an embassy to Delphi, to the sanctuary of Apollo, demanding one last consultation. The scene they found was one of heartbreaking desolation. The once thronged sacred way was overgrown. The magnificent treasuries stood empty and echoing. The priesthood, what remained of it, was impoverished and terrified of imperial and Christian authorities alike. According to a later Christian historian named Orosius, the Pythia was compelled to ascend the sacred tripod one final time. There was no intoxicating vapor, no eager crowd, only the ghost of a god departing. The prophecy she gave was not about Julian's campaign or the fate of empires. It was an epitaph for the oracle itself. In a weary voice she spoke these legendary, haunting lines: "Tell the king the fair wrought hall has fallen to the ground. No longer has Phobos a hut, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a spring that speaks. The talking water has dried up. Consider the devastating clarity of that message." It names the 3 sacred pillars of Delphic power and declares each one dead. The fair wrought hall was the magnificent temple, now spiritually fallen even if its stones still stood. Phobos, another name for Apollo, no longer had even a simple hut, a place of shelter, let alone a palace. The prophetic laurel, the leaves the Pythia chewed, and the god's sacred tree was barren. And finally, the spring that speaks, the Castalian spring where all seekers purified themselves, the very source of the oracle's clarity, had gone mute. The talking water had dried up. This was not a riddle. It was a direct, mournful report from the front lines of a lost war. The divine connection had been severed, not by conquerors, but by a fundamental shift in the cosmos itself. The god had packed up and left. Julian reportedly received this message with despair. He went on his Persian campaign and died shortly after, struck by a spear. His last words said to be, "You have won, Galilean." The prophecy proved tragically accurate for him and for the world he represented. Within a few decades, the Emperor Theodosius would issue decrees permanently banning all pagan worship. The Oracle of Delphi, along with all the others, was ordered closed. The Pythia fell silent forever. The springs were capped, the temples converted into churches or left to the slow erosion of time and weather. This last prophecy forces us to confront a monumental transition. For over a millennium, the Greek world had operated on a fundamental principle that the divine was immanent, present in specific places, in trees, in springs, in chasms, and would communicate directly with humanity through chosen vessels. The oracles were the switchboard for that conversation. Christianity introduced a radically different model, a transcendent God who spoke through scripture and church doctrine, not through localized ecstatic trances. The drying up of the talking water symbolizes this seismic shift from a world alive with countless divine voices to a world where the one God's word was mediated through a single, universal text. But the silence of Delphi is not just an ending, it is also a testament. That final, beautiful, heartbreaking utterance acknowledges its own obsolescence with a dignity that feels almost human. It is the sound of a 1,000-year-old institution signing its own death certificate, using the poetic form it perfected to announce its demise. The Pythia did not rage or plead. She simply reported the facts as the god showed her, that the hall was fallen, the laurel was silent, the spring was dry. In doing so, she gave the entire era of the oracles a perfect, elegiac closing line. The voices that had launched wars, saved cities, guided kings, and comforted farmers did not fade with a whimper. They signed off with one last, crystal-clear piece of truth, a prophecy that foretold the end of prophecy itself, leaving only the wind in the ruins to whisper of what was once believed. From the silent spring at Delphi to the whispering oak of Dodona, these 30 hidden stories reveal an institution of breathtaking complexity. The oracles were far more than fortune-telling booths. They were the ancient world's central nervous system, a network of sacred sites processing the raw data of human fear, ambition, and hope. We have seen them act as political spin doctors, economic consultants, military strategists, and even psychological therapists. They navigated the dreams of merchants, the betrayals of kings, the curses of rivals, and the quiet despair of ordinary people, all while balancing their own staggering wealth, internal corruption, and the terrifying responsibility of speaking for the gods. This incredible diversity, from the cosmic alignment of temples to the personal token of a soldier, is what makes their true story so endlessly compelling. They captivate us because they sit at the perfect crossroads of mystery, raw human psychology, and tangible history. They speak to that eternal, aching question we all carry: what comes next? The desire to lift the curtain, even just a corner, and glimpse the script of our own lives is a drive as old as consciousness itself. The oracles gave that desire a ritual, a language, and a place. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these untold stories resonated most deeply? Was it the slave who became an oracle, the child who spoke for the god, or the meteor that foretold its own sanctuary's end? Share your favorite piece of ancient lore or mystery in the comments below. If you want to join us for more deep dives into history's greatest enigmas, be sure to subscribe. We leave you with one final, lingering whisper from the past, a fragment of an oracle that seems to speak directly to our journey through memory and time. It said, "The future is a shadow cast by the past, and only by turning to face the light that made it can you understand its shape."